At its height, the Roman Empire was the dominant power of the ancient world. Its authority stretched from the provinces of Britannia to the borders of Mesopotamia. For centuries, its legions were the most effective fighting force known to man. Its engineering was without parallel, and its legal and linguistic traditions formed the bedrock of Western civilization. For a time, Rome seemed invincible, and then it collapsed. The popular narrative often attributes Rome's destruction to the barbarian invasions of the Goths, Vandals, and Huns. However, this view is incomplete. These invasions were merely the final symptom of a systemic decay that had been weakening the empire from within for centuries. The actual cause of Rome's fall was not an external force, but a series of catastrophic, self-inflicted wounds. The true explanation is found not with the enemies at the gates, but in the internal rot that brought the walls crumbling down. To understand the empire's collapse, we must first go back to the crisis of the 3rd century. This 50-year period was a political, military, and economic cataclysm that nearly destroyed the Roman state more than 2 centuries before its official fall in the West. The crisis began in 235 AD with the murder of Emperor Severus Alexander by his own troops. This act of mutiny triggered an era of unprecedented civil war. What followed was a violent, half-century-long struggle for power among ambitious Roman generals. In just 49 years, over 20 men laid claim to the imperial throne. Almost all of them met a violent end, often at the hands of the very soldiers who elevated them. These men are known as the barracks emperors, as their only claim to power was the backing of their legions. This constant infighting had devastating consequences. With Roman armies repeatedly marching across the empire to fight one another, the frontiers were left dangerously exposed. As a result, Germanic tribes such as the Goths and Alemanni poured across the Rhine and Danube rivers, pillaging deep into Roman territory. In the east, the Sassanid Persian Empire exploited the instability, overrunning provinces and capturing the Roman Emperor Valerian in battle. A profound humiliation for the empire. The state, once a unified whole, fractured into 3 competing entities: the Gallic Empire in the west, the Palmyrene Empire in the east, and the central Roman state in Italy, fighting for its survival. Internally, the empire's vast trade network broke down. The constant warfare made roads unsafe, and the economy, which depended on the movement of goods from Britain to Egypt, ground to a halt. On top of this, a severe pandemic, known as the Plague of Cyprian, swept through the empire, exacting a devastating toll on the population and crippling the workforce and the army. In some urban centers like Alexandria, the population may have declined dramatically. Although the empire was eventually reunited by strong military emperors like Aurelian and Diocletian, the damage was done. The crisis had exposed a fatal flaw in the Roman system. Its political stability was entirely dependent on a single, uncontested ruler, and it was unable to effectively govern its own immense size. The mistakes had been made, and the reforms that followed would ultimately set the stage for the final collapse. One of the most critical factors in Rome's downfall was the severe economic mismanagement that hollowed it out from within. The problem began with a simple concept: currency debasement. For centuries, the Roman silver coin, the denarius, contained nearly pure silver and was the lifeblood of the empire's trade. However, as imperial expenses grew, emperors found themselves short on silver. Instead of raising taxes on the elite, they chose to debase the currency. This meant reminting coins with less precious metal, mixing in cheaper materials like copper. The practice accelerated over time. Under Marcus Aurelius in the 2nd century, the denarius was about 75% silver. A century later, during the crisis of the 3rd century, emperors minting coins to pay their soldiers produced currency that was often less than 5% silver. The consequences were predictable: runaway hyperinflation. As people lost trust in the money, its value plummeted. Historians estimate that between 200 and 300 AD, prices may have inflated by as much as 15,000%. This economic chaos shattered Roman society. The vast gap between the wealthy elite, who owned land, and the poorer classes was stretched into an unbridgeable chasm. Bartering became common as citizens rejected the nearly worthless coins. To combat this, the government became more oppressive. Emperor Diocletian introduced a new tax system based on payments in kind, goods and labor, rather than currency. Farmers were bound to their land, and sons were forced into their fathers' professions in a desperate effort to keep the state functioning, laying the groundwork for medieval serfdom. Compounding the problem was Rome's reliance on slave labor. For centuries, conquests supplied enslaved people for the large agricultural estates. When Roman expansion halted in the 2nd century, this supply dried up, leading to a labor shortage and decreased agricultural production. The economic engine that had powered the empire for centuries had failed, leaving a state too broke and divided to defend itself. By the year 284 AD, the Roman Empire was on the brink of collapse. A soldier named Diocletian rose to power and embarked on a series of radical reforms to save it. He understood that the empire was simply too vast for one man to rule. His solution was the Tetrarchy, or rule of 4. In 293 AD, Diocletian formally divided the empire into an eastern and a western half. He would rule the east as the senior emperor, or Augustus, with a junior emperor, or Caesar, as his heir. He appointed a co-Augustus, Maximian, to rule the west, who also had his own Caesar. For a time, the system worked. The Tetrarchy ended the cycle of civil war and brought a degree of order back to the frontiers. Diocletian also enacted sweeping administrative reforms, expanding the bureaucracy in the army. However, the division of the empire had a catastrophic long-term consequence. It formalized a cultural and economic split between the Latin-speaking West and the Greek-speaking East. The two halves began to drift apart. The East was older, wealthier, and more urbanized, controlling lucrative trade routes. The West was more rural, less populated, and its economy had been hit much harder by the recent crises. All the wealth and resources began to gravitate eastward. When Constantine the Great came to power, he briefly reunited the empire, but then cemented the division in 330 AD by founding a new Rome, Constantinople, in the east. This permanently shifted the empire's center of gravity. From this point forward, the Western Roman Empire was the weaker partner. It had a smaller population, a weaker economy, and a government frequently paralyzed by internal struggles. The Eastern Empire, later known as the Byzantine Empire, often viewed the West as a liability, at times paying off barbarian tribes to attack the West instead of their own lands. Diocletian's division was a necessary measure for a desperate time, but it left the western half isolated, impoverished, and vulnerable. The Roman army was an icon of history, a disciplined force of citizen soldiers. Yet by the end, this same institution became an instrument of the empire's destruction. The change began with the Marian reforms of the late 2nd century BC. Facing a manpower shortage, General Gaius Marius abolished the property requirement for military service, opening the legions to the landless poor. This created a professional army, but it also had a fatal side effect. It shifted a soldier's loyalty. These new soldiers were loyal not to the state, but to the general who paid them and promised them land upon retirement. This reform created the private armies that commanders like Julius Caesar would use to wage civil wars and dismantle the Republic. This dangerous precedent continued through the centuries, but as the empire entered its final decline, a new problem emerged: the barbarization of the military. By the 4th and 5th centuries, it had become difficult to recruit enough Roman citizens. As a result, the state turned to the very people they had been fighting: foreign mercenaries. Increasingly, the Roman army was staffed by Germanic tribesmen, Goths, Franks, and Vandals. Eventually, entire tribes were hired as foederati, allied troops fighting under their own chieftains in exchange for pay or land. These soldiers were often effective warriors, but their loyalty was purely transactional. They fought for pay and for their own leaders, not for an empire whose culture they did not share. This created a terrifyingly unstable situation. Rome was now defending itself with an army of outsiders. When the pay was late, as it often was, these defenders could become its worst enemies. In the 5th century, barbarian generals like Stilicho, the Vandal, and Ricimer the Goth became the true powers in the West, controlling puppet emperors. The line between the Roman army and a barbarian warband had ceased to exist. The sack of Rome in 410 AD by Alaric and his Visigoths is the perfect example. Alaric was a former Roman military commander whose people felt betrayed by the empire. Their sack of the city was not an act of foreign conquest, but a violent negotiation for better terms. Rome had outsourced its own defense to an army that had no stake in its survival. When the money ran out, they simply took the empire for themselves. The fall of Rome cannot be attributed to a single cause, but rather to a cascade of interconnected failures. It was a political system so dependent on one man that it collapsed into civil war. It was an economic policy of currency debasement that unleashed hyperinflation and shattered society. It was a strategic decision to divide the empire that left its weaker half vulnerable. And it was a military transformation that shifted loyalty from the state to generals and finally to foreign mercenaries. The barbarian invasions were not the cause of the fall, they were the consequence. The Goths and Vandals did not topple a mighty empire. They merely pushed over a hollowed-out, rotten structure. The ultimate lesson from the fall of Rome is that the most dangerous threats often come not from external enemies, but from within, from political decay, economic mismanagement, and the erosion of the loyalties that hold a state together. Rome forgot what had made it great, and in the end, it was consumed by its own mistakes, leaving a warning that echoes through history.